Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today we're going to be tackling another mastering macro. In this one specifically, I want to dive into ultimates, ultimate economy, and how the way that we frame ultimates can dictate our compositions and the playbooks that we use once those compositions are decided. Let's jump right into it. Before we go any further, it's important to lay a strong foundation here and some common terminology that we'll use across this entire conversation. While we'll presumably share the majority of the basic terms, I still want to lay these out to avoid any confusion. For example, I use the term pips to refer to the individual points of charge towards an ultimate. E.g., a Sova is 5 out of 7 pips towards a Hunter's Fury, so on and so forth. Beyond that, I also have a number of categorizations that I use for ultimates, and that will really be where we start to dive into the first theory elements of this video. The first of these categories is conditional ultimates. These ultis are, shocker, conditional in either their use case, impact, or both. This could cover things like a conditional use case in a neural theft that will require a corpse to activate, or a conditional impact like a blade storm where the jet died immediately after activation. The next category is what I like to refer to as impact ultimates. This is where we're going to start veering into a little bit more subjective terminology. There's definitely going to be a little bit of debate as to whether certain ultimates are going to be put into this category or the one to follow it. Impact ultis are generally going to be unconditional in their use case and or have a guaranteed minimal impact. Great examples of these are going to be things like Run It Back and Seekers. You can use them wherever you want technically, and even if they go awry immediately, they still have some sort of minimal impact. A Run It Back, because of the shoutout and the threat to a site, is going to require some sort of immediate rotation or reaction from your opponents. Something like a Showstopper is another great example, where the mere activation of it, even if it doesn't end up meeting any targets, is going to force a positional adjustment in your opponents. The last category here is what I call power ultimates. They're still going to be unconditional in use case, very similar to impact ultis, but that guaranteed minimal impact is now going to shift to a round warping effect. Again, this is where we're going to get pretty subjective. Round warping is by no means an objective term here, so the way that you categorize some impact ultis and some power ultis is going to be more contingent on how you see the ultimate being able to be used rather than anything else. It could very easily be the case that I categorize something as an impact ulti, but someone who understands an agent better than I do comes up with a play that near infallibly provides extremely high conversion off that ult. For them, that will end up being a power ulti. And while I definitely don't want to get into each ultimate one by one because we would be here for over an hour, here's the general categorization that I have for all the ultimates currently in the game. The only one that I will touch on ever so briefly is Viper's Pit, because that is not a mistake, it's on the list twice. You see, on attack, Viper's Pit is an incredibly conditional ultimate. It's outrageously potent once you get it down, but to get it down is often an extreme challenge, requiring that you have sight control or control of whatever space you intend on using it on. By comparison, on defense, there are countless Viper's Pits that you can throw as soon as barriers drop, and they'll shut down entire sectors of maps. It's the only ultimate in the game that I believe has such an egregiously changed impact depending on side that I had to categorize it twice. But I digress. I just wanted to get these terms out there so no one was left in the dark. If you're one of the folks that's been watching my VCT co-streams, which are now regularly happening over at AnderzzTV on Twitch, you're already super familiar with these. I use them all the time when discussing the way that pro teams are competing. Now that we've laid the foundation of how we look at ultimates, categorize them, and really what they are to us, let's start taking a look at how we get to them. The first and most glaringly obvious way to farm up ultimates isn't even going to go on this list because of how fundamental it is to the game, and that's to kill your opponents and die yourself. Shocking, I know. You'll get 1 pip per elimination and 1 pip per death. Moving on to the real first item on this list, though, is orb control. Most players have some understanding of orb control at its most basic levels. You capture an orb, you get a pip, and you should focus those onto your highest priority ultimates. However, the way that I personally frame orb control actually breaks down into two very distinct silos that too often aren't differentiated. You have orb farming, the typical, I'll take this orb to farm my ultimate, but then you also have orb denial, which is the one that's more frequently ignored, and one that plays a greater impact the more competitively you play the game. You see, there are going to be orb positions on every map that have some sort of inherent bias towards either the attackers or the defenders. And the nature of that means that there will be some maps and some orbs where farming them just isn't a realistic option in many cases. In those scenarios that will, again, most frequently happen at the highest levels of play, your best bet is to try to deny the orb from your opponents rather than take it yourself. The marquee example of this is the Showers orb on Bind. Especially in North America, you will see teams scrap over this orb to no end because of how naturally contestable the position is. It's as close to a 50-50 orb as probably exists in the game. The overarching point here, though, is that orb control in both of its forms will play an increasingly prevalent role in Ultimate economy as we start applying more and more complex concepts to it. Hitting the next on the list, we have plants and diffuses. I feel like the majority of players at this point in time understand that allocating defuses to specific teammates that are near ultimates is a generally good idea, but I feel like it hasn't been until fairly recently in the professional levels of play that we see extremely proactive allocation of plants. If we think about it at a fairly abstract level, the ability to reliably allocate plant pips onto our key ultimates in a composition, that's one of the very few inherently attacker-biased functions in this game. On a defending half, you can't say, alright, we're going to plug in a defuse into the way that we're planning our ultimate economy out X number of rounds, but on the attacking side, you can say, regardless of which site we finish, we want to give X the plant here because that is something we know we have access to as an ultimate economy snowball mechanism. Obviously, that plant is still far from assured, but in the strictly plant versus defuse dichotomy, the attacker's side of that equation is going to be the one that is more readily plannable. And that will bring us to the last element on this list, which is eco-funneling. This is something that I still haven't seen implemented widely even at the highest levels of play, and that's that if you as a composition have a very clear farm ulti that you are focusing as the core of your ulti economy, and you win your pistol, you should be having that player hunt your opponents. You should be adjusting your default in such a way that you are putting that person in a position of first contact and high frag potential. It doesn't matter if that player is typically a deep sight anchor, it doesn't matter what position that person is typically in, you should be able to adjust the way that your team plays that ensuing round so that they can get to their ultimate faster. In previous discussions on this topic, I've been answered with, well, don't you need to focus predominantly on winning the round? And I say, absolutely, that will always be the case. But that is not mutually exclusive with having a grander macro strategy also in place at the same time. At a certain point, you have to be able to make minor default adjustments, even if they aren't technically the optimal ones, and trust your players to win gunfights when they have weapon advantage. That will wrap us up for the ways of getting to ultimates, and now we get to the real meat and potatoes of how you interlace the ultimates that exist in your composition. I think the simplest form of this that you will mostly be familiar with will be to take again that NA standard composition and break it on out. Every comp is going to have 5 agents and so 5 ultimates at their disposal, but not all alts are created equal. Even within the same category, there will be some level of differentiation in the way that your specific team wants to play that comp. In this example, for instance, you have 3 power ultimates in Run It Back, Hunter's Fury, and Cosmic Divide. We're going to be looking at this through the lens of the most common approach of current North American Tier 1 teams, and so the ultimate that usually rises to the top of that ladder is going to be the Run It Back. In the grander scheme of this comp's ult economy, that Run It Back then becomes the farm ultimate. Now that we've established which ultimate in our comp the farm ulti is, everything that we do from this point forward is seen through the lens of how we can get more Run It Backs. And that will bring us to the next step in this equation, which will be the Hunter's Fury, debatably the second most potent ultimate in this composition, and that will be what's called our Snowball ult. The objective here is to take our first run it back that we likely earned through early orb control as well as some kills on the first 2 rounds, to then move us directly into a follow-up Hunter's Fury. And that Hunter's Fury will have been earned via a couple kills that Sova potentially picked up himself, as well as spike plants and the orb control in the round that we are using the run it back, and thus the orbs can't be allocated towards the Phoenix. Moving past the Sova, we have the third and final power ulti in this composition, the Cosmic Divide, and this will be what I refer to as our Cascade ultimate. It's the one intended to close the loop and ensure that we've cycled around to another run it back. Obviously, there are still 2 more ultimates in this composition, so with that closed loop up top that represents the core of our ultimate economy, what are our intentions for these leftovers? Starting with Jet's Blade Storm, this is what I'll generally refer to as a buffer or bridge ultimate. It will generally be one of the better conditional ultis or an impact ulti, and it's more or less used as a gap filler to ensure that our primary ulti econ cycle doesn't hit any bumps. Last up, that brings us to Cypher's Neural Theft, and this is what I refer to as a luxury ultimate. This is a slot generally reserved for the far and away weakest ultimate in a composition, and it's really just used whenever available, because it's often such a conditional ultimate that it has to be used in such ways, otherwise it will never get put out. Neural Theft is the prime example of this, but the way that many teams are utilizing things like From the Shadows and Dimensional Drifts also very easily falls into this category. So at this point, we've hit a full framing of the ultimate economy of this NA standard setup. We have a core 3 ultimate cycle that is the crux of our econ. We have a buffer ultimate, and we have a luxury ult. A critical point of clarification here, though, is that while we do have that 3 ultimate cycle at the top, it's not truly a cycle. We have to remember what the primary objective of our ult econ management is in the first place, and that's to farm run it backs. So for example, if we just have a phenomenal round with our Hunter's Fury where Phoenix drops 3 kills, got an orb, and planted the spike, we're just gonna bypass the cycle. In the ensuing round, if we get him a single orb, run it back is online and we don't need to go through the entire sequence. The key directive of this entire setup is to get more run it backs and should always be remembered as such. To use another quick example just to cement these concepts, let's take a look at something that we see over in Europe. We have here one of the double controller mid-range comps that we now see showing up fairly frequently in the European meta. One of the particular reasons that I want to use this composition as an example is because it brings a further level of complication to the one that we just looked at, in that it has a very distinct shift in its ult econ when it switches sides. On its attacking half, its ult econ management looks something like this. Lockdown is the farm ultimate, which is used to snowball into orbital strikes and then cascaded through Seekers back to more lockdowns. Resurrect will be the buffer, and due to its harsh conditionality on attack, Viper's Pit will be used as a luxury here to secure post plants whenever possible. If we flip over to defense, the dynamic completely changes. Viper's Pit loses almost all of its conditionality with its ability to lock down entire segments of space on defense, so that becomes our farm ultimate. That's used to snowball into Brimstone ultimates, which are potent on retake, and that's used to cascade into lockdowns, which are again an incredibly potent retake tool. That will bring us back around to the Viper's Pits and complete our upper cycle. Seekers becomes our buffer ultimate, as its primary use case on defense is going to be as a counter timing mechanism or as a fairly weak retake tool, and then Resurrect will move to our luxury slot. This just goes to show that when using this particular ult econ framework, you can have very distinct shifts in the way that you want to play from one side to the next. And as a disclaimer before we move on, this is not the only ultimate management format. In both these examples, we saw a 3-part upper cycle with a buffer and a luxury. But there will be some teams and compositions and playstyles that use methods completely divergent from this. In some cases, you'll have 2 power ultimates as the primary cycle, really just being a back and forth, with 2 buffer ultimates and a luxury, or 3 buffer ultimates. And even more different still, you'll sometimes get scenarios where the ultimates aren't even done in a linear fashion like this, they'll be paired up in ult combos more akin to Overwatch. Comps like that will generally plan around a pair of very well orchestrated ulti rounds, both of which will use 2 ultimates, and then the 5th ulti in their stack will be a buffer that helps transition between the two. These comps are rare and typically incredibly hard to pull off due to the burden of orb control that's required to reliably cycle pairs of ultimates rather than singles. And even through all of this, you'll still have inconsistencies that appear due to reactive play. For instance, if I'm forced to use my Hunter's Fury in order to deny my opponent's lockdown, that is a correct play that will break my cycling. There is no infallible way to use this ult-econ management and not have to still play around your opponents in some capacity, and that's why things like buffers are used to insulate this system. Now that we've gone through all of the abstract theory of this and seen how it can be applied directly to a composition, let's see what it actually looks like in action. If we go back to the finals of Challengers 2 here in North America, it was a pairing between Cloud9 Blue and Sentinels. I've gone through the process of mapping out which ultimates were used by each team on which rounds throughout every map of this set. Looking at this distilled perspective allows us to see just how well spread and managed the ultimates were. As a matter of fact, it was over half of all rounds played throughout this set that at least one ulti was coming out from either side. And if we move over to the end result, we can see how impactful the incremental advantage can be from effective ult management. Sentinels ended up winning this set, and in doing so, used 8 more ultimates than Cloud9. Those 8 ultimates translated to over 40 pips of materialized advantage. In what I'm sure is surprising to no one, the team that used more ultimates won here, albeit that's subject to a little bit of interpretation. There's the lingering question of, did Sentinels get more ultimates because they were already winning, or were they winning because they were more effectively using and snowballing their ultimates? And unfortunately, I don't think there's any way to infallibly prove that one way or the other. The best I can do is provide you with 2 things. First, if we look back to that round-by-round overview of when ultimates were used, we can take a look at each team, their overarching approach, and how the map went based off of the way that their ultis looked in sequence. Specifically, I want to highlight maps 2 and 3 as soft evidence towards the concepts we've been referencing throughout this video. Starting with map 2, we can clearly see that Sentinels was trying to farm Phoenix ultis. It was the exact composition that I discussed earlier. In round 4, they get onto a Phoenix ultimate as well as a Hunter's Fury, and so slam those, winning the round and beginning their cycle. 2 rounds later, they land on that 3rd element, the Cosmic Divide. That gets them most of the way to another run it back, but not all the way, so in the 7th they use a Jet Blade Storm in order to buffer, and then on the 8th they're back on their 2 power ultis. They snowball onto a 3rd Hunter's Fury in the 10th, and then a 3rd run it back on the 12th, and they walk away from that half 7-5 advantaged. Meanwhile, if we look over at the Cloud9 side, there was no measurable cycling happening. As a matter of fact, at baseline, C9's composition lacked any clear planning for an ult-econ snowball like this. They were running Reyna, Raze, Sova, Omen, Cypher, and in that scenario, you can count them out yourself how many power ultimates were there. They had Hunter's Fury, which is debatably one of the weakest power ultimates because depending on how well it's used, it can be more of an impact ulti. They have Showstopper, which is a strong impact ulti. They have From the Shadows, which is a weak impact ulti. And then Empress and Neural Theft, which are both very weak conditional ults. They used that early Showstopper to try to match the firepower of Sentinel's initial run-it-back Hunter's Fury round, but that ultimate simply isn't going to be able to equalize the snowball that's going to come out of that power ulti pairing. Sentinels snowballed and cycled their ultimates incredibly effectively, and C9 had no answers. If we look at map 3, it's an interesting scenario because it's almost the opposite. This is a map that ended up going to overtime. I simply don't have the 2 overtime rounds listed here because there were no ultimates used. But we can see that it was C9's best shot at giving Sentinels a run for their money. And if we look at the ultimates that they used, it becomes pretty apparent why that was. C9 was cycling their ultimates incredibly well. They're using their two impact ultis, Blade Storm and Showstopper, to bridge the gap between their Rolling Thunders and Lockdowns, especially when we look to their second half, where they absolutely popped off. If we look to Sentinels for comparison, it's nothing super egregious, but they make the questionable decision of never throwing a Cosmic Divide the entirety of the map. Instead, they're going for what is really just a two-sided cycle between a Blade Storm Empress combo round and a Resurrect. Now, this may come off as me just trying to force my theory into being correct, but I honestly believe that C9 won this map from a macro-strategic perspective. Their ult-econ management was flatly better than Sentinels, and it took Sick dropping a +11 game to still only barely drag Sentinels across the finish line in OT. And while this isn't hard evidence by any stretch of the imagination, it's more than legitimizing enough for me to believe that a team that is effectively cycling their ultimates in the ways that we've discussed thus far, they're going to be favored to win a map far more often than not. And where I promised two pieces of evidence, this second one is far more simple and goes to my roots as it's just a statistic. We've already seen that Sentinels showed great intentionality in the way that they were cycling their ultimates on the second map, and that they were efficient enough in the third map as well to still hold their weight. But now we'll also see that across all of the maps, they were just more effective when it came to translating those ultimates into round wins. C9's round win rate when using at least one ultimate scraped by at only 53.9%. When we look at Sentinels by comparison, that conversion rate jumps to nearly 71%. Sentinel's double-pronged attack here of not only incredibly effective ult usage, but incredibly effective ult management as well, made them all but an unstoppable force here in that grand final, and lends a lot of weight to the concepts we've discussed here today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this mastering macro. If there's a concept in particular that I haven't covered in this series yet, that you're dying to hear about or have discussed, let me know down in the comments below and I'll do my best to get it into the pipeline. Per the usual, if you're enjoying my content, you can find me at AnderzzTV all across the internet, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, you name it, I'm probably on it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.